I would like to ask you a question. Who shapes the city? Well, most of us are architects here, but we could be urban designers, planners, sociologists, geographers, etc., etc. We've got this kind of top-down, kind of heavy, let's create this environment planning system at place at the moment. And this question has been asked by many people, one of which was David Harvey, who in his Right to the City paper kind of talks mostly about capitalism, and he critiques it as a financial kind of private ownership, investors having this power to kind of create and shape the environment that we live in. But he also talks about this right to the city as a right, as our right to shape ourselves by changing the city. The question is, do we do that? Of course, the right to the city was conceived by Henry Lefebvre, who, amongst other things, says that this right to the city is actually the right to urban life. That means that you and I, we have a right to urban life. And he also says that it is only the working class that can renew this urban life, because we've lost it. I mean, Alison kind of quite nicely kind of put this together, so I'm not going to kind of go there anymore. Hopefully you listened. Within this built environment and social kind of phenomena, relationship between the two, this kind of topic has been tackled, and the relationship between them by many thinkers and practitioners like Jane Jacobs, William Holley White, Jan Gehl, and lots of others. Within these two kind of spheres, I'm particularly interested in temporary urbanism as a kind of subgroup within the built environment. And I'm also looking at these social interactions, because I believe that urban life is evident where these social interactions happen, and that's when it's at this kind of peak, whether positive, of course. And then we've got, for this kind of setting, we've got the question of design research. So where does this all sit in? Now, temporary urbanism is still quite a big kind of chunk of sphere, because we could be talking about parking bicycle, painting bicycle lanes, putting up cones to kind of make safe passages through the traffic, etc. So we started looking at a closer kind of smaller subgroup of that, which was temporary. I call them temporary urban interventions. And I set myself some criteria. So I said that, okay, these interventions will have to create social community life, provide for that. So they're not only kind of prettifying or beautifying the environment, which lots of interactions do, or kind of signposting. So that was, for me, the key, because I was looking at this urban life question. Another one was that they were meant to be intended as temporary, whether, and that's, they could be only a placeholder for the time being, or a gap filler, or they could be test beds that could lead to longer change, something that you kind of see what it works and you change and remake it. And thirdly, that they would be within the publicly used open space. And I don't care whether this is privately owned or it's a public space, and that's where it gets somehow interesting. So temporary urbanism, or temporary urban interventions, are kind of defined there, and they afford a lot of things. They're mostly, predominantly, user-led. So it's actually these people, us, who create them. And they produce this environment that has a sense of place. They reclaim underutilized spaces within the austerity times, economic downturn. There are lots of places that have been misused, underused, and very marginal, limited spaces. And these temporary urban interventions have the potential to activate them, to reclaim them, to utilize them for social public life. One of such examples, great example, is El Campo de Cebada in Madrid, in Spain. What happened here was that this was a square within one of the districts, La Latina district. And it had, for a long time, a big market, and it was changed, rebuilt. They had a leisure center there with a swimming pool. This was deteriorated, so they demolished it with a view that it will be rebuilt. The economic crisis hits us, and there's a plain field, basically concreted area with this big kind of lowered part where the swimming pool was, and it's hoarded off because it's unsafe and we can't have people using it. So after a 2 weeks event, that was held in Madrid, the people kind of liked using this space. They kind of camped there for a couple nights and had some kind of dance and music. Exist did their Lido there for 2 weeks as well. And the community actually decided, this doesn't have to be a wasted space. This doesn't have to be a vacant space. We could do something with it. So with some architects, they formed this neighborhood group, and they started changing this environment and appropriating it to their use. And funny thing was that when we talk about this design research, I'm going to borrow Luis's kind of framing of this and posing this design research onto someone else. Perhaps what these guys are doing here is kind of by changing this environment, changing the elements within it and appropriating it and perfecting it, creating lots of iterations, that they're actually making it more and more suitable for what they actually want for particular activities. So I found that there's this cycle. There's this cycle of forms and processes where you create a form using different social interactions, you engage different processes, and then that creates a social space. Now that cycle uses processes like design, negotiation, sourcing of materials, fundraising, processes of production, and actual use. And all these trigger creating new forms. And these forms, because they're used and tested, etc., then draw you back to yet cycle of processing or producing something else. So this is a concept I took, one more thing. I really like Florian Kosak's quote. He talks about temporary urbanism as a laboratory in real space. And this is quite crucial for temporary urban interventions because they happen in one-to-one. It's not like us, we like playing with models a lot. But this one-to-one kind of scale does something to objects, to you kind of seeing it being there, being within this model, and this model becomes your life, your space, your urban life. So there's this experimentation with production forms and processes. And so I, last year, took upon myself within this design research module, I've been part of that, a question whether there could be a temporary urban project that could trigger or promote playful social interaction. Social interaction was not enough anymore. So I started playing. I set myself a set of rules based on lots of reading and kind of looking at different examples, analyzing those, etc. And started playing, starting with a simple shape and assessing that, evaluating it, changing it, reforming it. So that's when those iterations come into place. Until I kind of found a shape of an object that would trigger, in my view, most of the playful social interactions. So then I had to start thinking about how to model this thing. I was still playing with models, see? Because we do that, don't we? So I started looking with phone, kind of we have turned, I just used what we had here. I'm a student still, so I don't have much money to experiment with lots of big stuff. But soon enough, I found something that linked me to this Florian Kosak's quote, that it's actually a real scale thing. This model was no longer useful to me because it couldn't do some things that I realized soon enough a big one could do. So I developed kind of these different structures, critiqued them, and then put it to place. So these were one-to-one models, big like that, created out of cards, because it was nice and simple and quick and fun to do as well. And then looked at how I could wrap them, how I could stabilize the structure, how I could kind of form them. But what was crucial for me, once I reached a certain point, I had to test them in real life. So I borrowed a bunch of students here, and it was very awkward for them to start playing with them. It's quite funny. But quite soon enough, they started developing these games with these objects. And this was quite racing. Firstly, they use this object, I found, as something they know, which is a ball. They started racing, rolling it. However, later on, they realized, actually, okay, this is not a ball, this is something different. So we could stack these things. And they had to, of course, interact with each other and started creating this kind of space of social interaction where this life happened suddenly. They stacked it not only on one each other, but also on themselves. And so this object became kind of like a projection of themselves or extension of themselves. You can see them here jousting, which was surprising to me because some things you as a researcher, you don't realize that will happen. You just have to wait and see, and it happens. And then they actually personified them. So they use them as another player, as a person, and that goes back to what Michael was talking about earlier. And finally, they inhabit them. So they started wearing them. They put them on each other. And so, so with that, I realized that actually, when it comes to these temporary urban interventions, they have this ability to create this urban life because we make them, because we test them, because we kind of reappropriate them to what we need them for. And that's using social interaction processes and forms and recreation and experimentations. And I believe that it is because they are temporary that they allow us to experiment with these real-scale forms and processes to kind of create potential for urban public life. And I would like to finish with a quote from David Harvey again, who says that the right to the city is far more than the individual liberty to access urban resources. It is a right to change ourselves by changing the city. It is moreover a common rather than an individual right, since this transformation inevitably depends upon the exercise of a collective power to reshape the processes of urbanization. The freedom to make and remake our cities and ourselves is, he wants to argue, one of the most precious, yet most neglected of our human rights. Thank you.